Recording in progress.
Okay. Dear members and guests of the Brazilian Association for Music Theories and Analysis, it is with great pleasure that we are beginning the first session of the 2022 cycle of online lecture meetings. Michael Klein, our guest today, is for us a very special friend because he has been supporter of our association since its inception. He published in our journal, lectured in our congress, besides other valuable contributions. The topic for his online lecture today, directly from the city of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, United States, is a pitch class motive as a Lacanian symptom in Prokofiev's Piano Sonata N.6. Allow me to present a brief introduction of Professor Michael Klein. I will share my screen now. And people will have problems to enter the rooms if they are late. Because I will be talking with... Okay. No, I did something wrong. I have to do... no, where is my screen? Do you see the screen now?
Yes.
Okay.
No, I will do without the okay. Okay. Michael Klein has a bachelor degree in piano performance from Eastman School of Music, a master of piano performance and literature from Eastman School of Music, and a PhD of music theory from State University of New York at Buffalo. He is a professor of music theory and music studies at Temple University since 1999. At the graduate level, Klein has taught seminars in music semiotics, music and meaning, music narrative, musical subjectivity, music and Freudian tradition, sonata theory, the chamber music of Brahms, the theories of soundtrack, and so on. He's an walking encyclopedia. In 2005, he earned the Lindbeck Award for Excellence in Teaching. He has published 3 books. His first book, Intertextuality in Western Art Music, from Indiana Press of 2005. 2005 is his first book. I think it derives from his dissertation, PhD dissertation, and he was working in Lutoslavsky at the time. I went to UT, and this book is about mostly has wonderful analysis of Lutoslavsky. His second book with Nicholas Ryland is about the music narrative since the 1900s, and he's a very important book. And recently he published in 2015 a third book, The Music and the Crisis of the Modern Subject, that I think is related to the talk he will do today. And so welcome, Professor Michael Klein, and the microphone is yours, and also the screen.
Okay, very good. Let me share my screen if I can. Share. And I have to make this be a presentation, and here we are. Can you all see this all right?
We do. It's okay.
I'm going to make you all disappear so that I can see the screen myself. I'm sorry. If you have a question, just shout out. And of course, there'll be questions at the end. I'm really, really delighted to be here. As you heard from Rodolfo, actually, he didn't say, probably maybe embarrassed to say, I was once his teacher at the University of Texas at Austin, but now he's the student has become the master. I think he's much more smart than I am. But I probably, my one of the greatest moments in my career was going to Brazil 8 years ago. I am so honored that you invited me there. I felt so welcome there, and this is something I just shared with my wife. If I go to a theory conference in the United States and I try to talk about Lacan, no one understands what I'm talking about, and then they just ask, well, what about the E flat in measure 3? And I think, I guess you didn't understand anything of what I was saying. What I loved about going to Brazil, I was talking about narrative, and everyone knew what narrative was and how it worked. And I thought, oh my God, educated people, this is great. I appreciate people that are, sorry to put it this way, that are, broadly read and don't just focus on, their little slice of the world. And that was my experience in Brazil, that you were all broadly read and could follow an argument other than, here's a tonic and here's a dominant. So hopefully I'll be able to get through when I get to the Lacan part of my paper. I just want to make sure, because I actually made it so that I can see some of you, is the slide clear to you or is it covered up?
For us, it's perfect. Don't.
It's okay, yes, very good.
Very good. All right, so, whoops, I have to go back to this. All right, so here's just an overview of the paper. I think that, Rodolfo, if you don't mind that I call you by your first name, and I know that the R should be like an H, Rodolfo. So, did I say it right? Yes, I did. I don't think you corrected me when you were in Texas. But in any case, I think he did send a copy of the paper, which I'm very happy about because parts of it are very difficult. But I'd rather not read a paper. I'd rather just sort of talk to you. And this slide just helps me remember what I'm supposed to do next. So the first part, very short, I'll be talking about, Prokofiev's Sixth Sonata, basically the fourth movement. And Prokofiev has often been described as writing wrong note music, so I'll describe that. It won't take long. And then I'll move on to turning those wrong notes into what we call, in the United States anyway, a pitch class motive. I'll explain what that is. It's an obvious concept. And then I'll show how the pitch class motive works in the Prokofiev. And then there's a change of gears, and this is where it's going to get a little nasty, I think, only because it's difficult. And I'll be talking about Lacan and his model of subjectivity. And then finally, I'll apply what we know about Lacan to the Prokofiev. Rodolfo is correct. This is an extension of the work I did in my last book. I've been interested in Lacan now for well over a decade. And so, I'm still working on Lacan. So many people have called Prokofiev's music wrong note music. In other words, it's sort of a diatonic frame with some notes that stick out. And I thought at first that this was only a phenomenon in the United States, but because I do work on Lutoslawski, I was reading once this is quite a while ago, but I was reading an interview that he did, and he actually says, I just don't like Prokofiev's music. It just sounds like too many wrong notes. And, it just sounds like a diatonic piece with wrong notes. And he said, that's just no way to compose. So what is a wrong note? So it's the use of a dissonant chromatic note that mars the surface of a diatonic frame. And I have an example for you. Oh, sorry, I forgot about this. There are a number of people who have tried to write about these wrong notes, at least in the United States, and I've listed them here. I think that you all may have a copy of this PDF. If you don't, just write to me, michael.klein@temple.edu, and I'm happy to send you a copy. But these are some people who have written about the wrong note. Okay, so here's an example, and it's from the Sixth Sonata. In the U.S. and the U.K. we call it the War Sonata, and I'm going to play for you from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about the 5th bar in, the end of the first line. This is the second tonal area, and in the left hand, it's basically all C. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But as we go through, sorry, I was being pretty clever here, I thought, but as we go through, there are notes that stick out. So, sorry. So these notes that just, if I think of it as a tonal work, there are these notes that just sound wrong. The first is this D sharp, which has an arrow on it, and then the F sharp, and then the D sharp comes back and the F sharp. Now, how people before this have dealt with these notes, at least in the United States and the UK, is basically with a Schenkerian model. So, for example, that F sharp resolves up here, right? So they will say that instead of doing that, and the D sharp is sort of resolved in the left hand. I confess, I just don't hear that. So I confess that these notes really stand out to me, and I'm not happy with making them go away, of wishing them away. And so that's why, that's where this talk comes from. So that's an example of wrong notes in Prokofiev. And we're done. Now you know that, and we're all done. All right, so I'm going to reconfigure a wrong note as what we call in the United States and the UK, a pitch class motive. This is a very simple concept. You may already know it, but I just want to make sure. The term pitch class motive comes from a dissertation by Stephen Leitz called The Pitch Class Motive in Songs of Franz Schubert. And what he did was he discovered that in certain songs, you might be, let's say, in the key of G, and there would be an E flat in the key of G. And then later Schubert would go to the key of C, and the E flat would come back. And then later he might go to the key of F, and there was the E flat again, so that this pitch class was recurring regardless of what key Schubert was in, but it always kind of worked out in a Schenkerian way. Patrick McCrellis, if you're interested in pitch class motives, the kind of history of them, this is a fantastic article, which is free online if you just Google it. And it gives us a whole history of the pitch class motive. You can probably guess when the first pitch class motives start to appear in music. It's around Beethoven. It's around Beethoven's time. So McCrellis gives a definition. So a pitch class motive is a particular chromatic note that problematizes a piece such that the tonal plot of the piece turns in important respects to what happens to that note and how its harmonic implications ramify across musical time. So how do we say that in simpler English? It's a chromatic note that simply reappears over and over in a piece, often in different ways. I won't play this example yet, but our locus classicus for this is the Eroica Symphony. So Scott Burnham, in his book on Beethoven's heroic period, says that the first 7 bars of Beethoven's Eroica Symphony are the most raked over 7 measures in all of music, and he's probably right. So, I mean, you all know. Uh-oh, there's the C sharp, right? And everyone, I mean, I teach the piece, we talk about the C sharp, and it's right there near the beginning. It's an odd pitch. C sharp is the leading tone of the leading tone, so it's not a common, chromatic note. And if you know the pieces, I know you all do, the C sharp comes back, sometimes as a D flat where it resolves down, and then it resolves. Sometimes it's a key in the development. It's briefly a key. D flat major comes as a key, and it just comes back over and over in different guises. But by the end of the piece, it's gone. So the end of the coda, the C sharp is gone, and all we hear is. And we hear that over and over. And so Beethoven has sort of written out the mode of it, is kind of cured by the end. I'm giving you another example here, and this is the Brahms Clarinet Sonata number 1, in F minor, a late piece. And I've pointed out where the pitch class motive is. I used to know this piece, right? The G flat. And you might think, so what, as a G flat? But as we go along, the G flat just keeps coming back. The G flat is sort of integrated here. It doesn't sound out of place at all. And you think, well, Brahms has fixed it. It does come back many times. I'm not going to go through all of them. But probably the most interesting is that the recapitulation starts in F sharp minor. It starts on the wrong note, and it starts on that pitch class. Now as an F sharp, but it starts in the wrong key. And so now it's sort of invaded the piece. It's sort of, it's made its presence felt. So this would be another example of a pitch class motive, and in this case, one that really starts to take over the trajectory of the music. I'm not going to go further on this so that we have time for the Prokofiev. By the way, if you get bored, just tell me and I'll stop. Okay, so I don't want to bore people. This example. Oh, and also I should tell you, my dog does not like music. So my dog might appear and start barking, and that's that's the way it is. All right, I'm going to gloss this one. You might ask, can this work in post-tonal music? This idea of the pitch class. I happen to mention this to a colleague of mine. His name is Jan Kwiswicki, and he is a composer. And I told him about this idea, and he said, oh, I think about that all the time when I compose. He said, he writes, in a post-tonal idiom, and he said, and I'll think, there's an A flat. You know what? I'm going to bring that A flat back, later. And then he said, and then sometimes he'll write, and he goes, the A flat will just start appearing, like all by itself in some weird way. And he said, he was very interested in this idea and how it could be applied to tonal music. I'm not going to play this. It's so very famous. It's the Schoenberg little piece. But I noticed that the first chromatic note I get is an F sharp, and I noticed that when it happens, the register right before the register has opened up. I then noticed that the F sharp appears up in this upper register. Right? It appears down here in this lower register. And it appears in this kind of, there's like a mini Mahler symphony all in one measure, where we have. This is like the big moment in a Mahler symphony, and look, there's our F sharp at the bottom. And then when the piece ends, I think I got that wrong. There you go. And there's the F sharp again in our last chord. So what do I learn by tracing this F sharp through? I learn how Schoenberg uses register. He opens up the register first, and then he builds the register down at the bottom. And he also uses the F sharp strategically at the two most kind of important expressive chords in the piece. So the F sharp does have a function in the piece other than just, well, here's an F sharp. I just throw that out so that you know it doesn't have to be a tonal piece, although I don't want to go through Wozzeck and trace all the D sharps in it. I mean, you know, that just seems like something for a computer to do. All right, that's what a pitch class motive is. And now this first part is easy. I mean, the first three parts are, I think, simple enough. We go to the Prokofiev sonata. As I told you, at least in the States, we call it the War Sonata. This was written in 1939, I don't need to tell you, but because I have students who don't even know when World War II was, I'll just repeat that, you know, at this point, the Poles had already been invaded, and Stalin was preparing for the invasion of the USSR at this point when Prokofiev is writing this sonata, which is why we call it, at least we call it, the War Sonata. So there's this whole section about, which I think I'm just going to gloss, about the form of the piece. I think I may get back to this later if we have time. I'm going to skip this for now. It just seems like a lot of verbiage for not a whole lot of payoff, but I'll come back to it in a bit. Basically, though the last movement is a sonata rondo, although it has three themes instead of two. So it's like a three-key exposition where there's a refrain in between. And everything comes back in reverse order at the end of the piece. So everything kind of goes in reverse. So here we have the refrain. I'm going to play it for you first. And I noticed right away that there are these D sharps that come over and over. They even appear in the bass, and they even appear as a scale. And in some way, this refrain all by itself does what a pitch class motive tends to do throughout a piece. We hear it first early, right? Then we hear it again, then we hear it again. And then it's sort of integrated here with, it gets its own scale. And then you could say it disappears, although you can see it that it comes back. So now I will tell you personally, the D sharp doesn't really bother me that much. I mean, it sounds rather cool to me, but you'll see how this D sharp is going to play a bigger and bigger role as the piece goes on. So I'm just going to go through, you know, this part is rather mechanical. You just sort of go through and see how the pitch is used as it goes on. And this is the transition of the that leads to the second key area, and very strangely, it's in G sharp. All right, so you could argue that in the 20th century, who cares what key you go to? So that's one argument. It's not an argument I particularly buy, because Prokofiev is known for following sort of in large scale key structures that are more normative. Someone mentioned Riemann. You can think of this in a Riemannian way. You could think that we're in A minor, E major would be the dominant, and if I do a leading tone exchange, I get G sharp, and that gives me this key. And it turns out that in Russian music, using a minor chord on the leading tone is a pretty common thing. So you could say, well, he's just doing a kind of common Russian thing. But what I find interesting here is now the D sharp is integrated. The D sharp is no longer outside the key, but it's part of the key. So in some sense, you could say that Prokofiev has made the D sharp fit. It fits in with the overall tonal environment. For me, though, that gets dashed right away when we get to the end of this short transition. Sorry. I just think dramatically, even though you could say that the D sharp resolves at E, the D sharp really sounds like a foreign element that is interrupting C major. That's how it sounds to me. So it's almost like the E is trying to erase the D sharp to me, not resolve it, but make it go away. So we have had already two moments of integration, but then also moments where the D sharp or E flat is troubling. Now we get it in a pretty integrated way here. This is the second theme, and I'll play this for you slowly. It's really just an altered dominant here, right? So it's integrated into the theme, but we have. If any of you have perfect pitch, you know we hit a D sharp there in the middle, right? This sounds like typical, if you know a lot of Prokofiev, pianists tend to, so this sounds like fairy tale music to me. This sounds like the music he wrote for Cinderella and other kind of fairy tales that he does. And so the D sharp, and this is, sorry to back up, this is typical of the hermeneutics of sonata form, that if you have that first theme I find to be kind of driven and not tragic, but sort of driven and intense, the second theme tends to give us an alternate reality, a kind of alternate universe. And this is our alternate kind of fairy tale universe that he gives us. And the D sharp is rather integrated. But by the end of the theme, now as an E flat, the D sharp is a little more nasty sounding. So we have, I'm going to play from the top. So especially when we get here, that E flat just does not sound integrated to me. It sounds forceful, and in fact, it even changes the tonal trajectory of the piece. We're in C major, the E flat leads us down to B flat. There's a mistake in the score here. This should be, oh no, it is this. Right, leads us to an odd key, B flat minor. All right, then we get, because it's a rondo, we get that refrain again. The D sharp sounds integrated to me. And if it weren't a three-key sonata, this piece has gone on long enough that I would think this is the end of the exposition. We're done. If you listen to the piece, it sounds like a complete thought here. But we have another kind of invasion of the D sharp, and I'm gonna play through the next slide without showing it to you first to see what Prokofiev does. But just to reemphasize this, in the bass, the D sharp is just a lower neighbor, so it definitely fits. The right hand has that motive. Does it fit so well there? I mean, it's an escape tone, I suppose. But then we get the kind of surprise third theme. So yeah. And that theme looks looks like this. And suddenly we're in G sharp minor. The third key is G sharp minor. So, and because it's G sharp minor, here's the chord in the left hand, the D sharp fits again. It's integrated. But you might say in another way that the D sharp has taken over the tonal trajectory of the piece. Like, well, no, I need to fit. I'm going to make this music fit around me. And the odd thing then is the note that doesn't fit is a D, which is really what should have been at the beginning. Right? The D is the note that was changed at the beginning. Now the D becomes like the odd note out. So we get. And it gets pretty intense here. So we have this odd key situation. We're in A minor, we go to C major, we go back to A minor as if everything's over, and then down to G sharp for the exposition. Now, if it isn't clear that that D sharp is an element that doesn't belong, Prokofiev makes it pretty clear at the very end of the exposition. We head back to A minor, and this is what we get. That bare tritone, again, if you wanted to, you could say, well, in 20th century music, composers tend to use the tritone as a dominant substitute, or you could say, you know, so what, it's a tritone. But I'm thinking of Prokofiev as basically a tonal composer. And this particular D sharp, it just doesn't, for me, it doesn't belong. It really sounds like a wrong note. I'm not going to do the development because it's long and quite chromatic, but Prokofiev he marks the D sharp in particular ways all the way through, and this is the end of the development, and we go into the third theme because everything is reversed in the recapitulation. So what we get here. There's the D sharp as our highest note at the end of the rhyme. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you know, right there. So and we get the third theme now. Right. And our third theme, the note that doesn't belong, is the E flat. So we have, sorry. Finally, the E flat comes, we get the third theme again, but this time in E flat minor, so now it's become a key of its own. It's the first time, other than that scale earlier, that the E flat becomes a key. So it's to me, it's really starting to take over the tonal trajectory of the piece. And I'm not playing you the second theme. I promise you there are D sharps in there too. And the coda brings us back to the first theme. And now we notice that Prokofiev starts to harmonize that theme, and he harmonizes it with that G sharp minor chord, and there's the D sharp. And by the end, everything just falls apart. All right, so I'm going to play you part of the coda. It's quite loud and obnoxious, so I'm sorry about that. And pianists like to play loud and obnoxiously, but you'll notice that I think this is the easiest part to see. The right hand makes this kind of desperate effort to outline A minor with these scales. Meanwhile, in the left hand, we get E flat, then B flat, then G. A major triad on E flat. So that pitch class motive now is coming back. So how does this sound? I'm sorry, it's pretty nasty, and I'm sorry if there's distortion. I'll try to not play it too loudly. So I think at this point, there's no doubt that those E flats are just interrupting. Now, the problem is in many of these other pieces, the pitch class motive works its way out throughout the piece. It's cured. This E flat is never cured. The very last thing we hear is a fanfare, and the fanfare is on an E flat. So I'm going to play you part of this. So we have. So our last big gesture, I haven't played you the last cadence. There is one cadence at the end. Our last big gesture is on an E flat. So it hasn't been erased. It hasn't been solved. In fact, it's sort of taken over the piece as you go. Okay, so that was a quick tour. That's something, I should teach this piece to undergraduates to show them how a pitch can control things. So I hope that was, pretty clear. Now we need to take a short breather. I need a glass of water before we do Lacan. I'm sorry, it's just the way things are. And my dog was snorting. I don't know if you heard. Okay, I know that several of you already know Lacan because of the questions that were sent to me, but I'm going to pretend that you know nothing about Lacan, if that's okay with you. So in many circles, people call Lacan the French Freud. He's in the Freudian tradition, and there's no way for me to explain the complexity of his thought in 10 minutes. But so anything that I have to say now, for I know that there are some who know Lacan, you might say, whoa, you skipped a lot there. Yep, I did. But it's just a matter of time and the time that we have. So he's the French Freud, and basically what he does with Freud is he applies, in some sense, semiotics to Freud. So the ideas of the sign and how the sign works, this becomes part of how he envisions how people work. And probably the most influential French thinker, although he was a practicing psychoanalyst too, in the middle of the 20th century. So virtually every French writer or philosopher, so Foucault and Deleuze and Derrida, they're all influenced by Lacan. His star kind of fell for a while, and it's Žižek, Slavoj Žižek, who brought Lacan kind of back to life for people who do research outside of psychoanalysis. I've just listed two books that I think are excellent, and especially if you like movies, this one, Enjoy Your Symptom, Jacques Lacan in Hollywood and Out. He explains movies with Lacan, like why does this movie do what it does? Oh, I have to go here. And if you have, I should do it this way. If you want, if you have a copy of this, and again, if you don't, just send me an email. These are some sources that I think are easier than this source by Lacan called Écrit. The first one is excellent. I think a very clear exposition of Lacan's thought. This one I put up, Jean-Michel Rabaté, is actually I'm not name dropping, he's a friend of mine, he teaches at UPenn, and he edited this collection. Just as an aside, I mentioned Žižek, and sorry, I have to just tell this story. At the beginning of The Sublime Object of Ideology, he writes, without a footnote, it was Lacan that Freud discovered the symptom. And I actually wrote to Zizek and said, where did you find this? Because I don't know anything in Lacan where he says that. So I then went to Jean-Michel Rabaté at UPenn, and I said, where did Zizek get this? And Jean-Michel said, he made it up. He said, basically what Zizek does is he pretends to be an expert on Lacan, which he kind of is, but whenever Lacan doesn't say what he wants him to say, he just makes him say something else. And so then I kind of learned my lesson that you have to be very careful when you read Zizek, because he's just using Lacan as like an authority figure. But in any case, and there are some musicologists who have worked on Lacan, David Schwartz, Lawrence Kramer, Sarah Reichardt. I really admire this book. Sarah Reichardt, I don't know if you, Rodolfo, if you remember her. She was at UT Austin when you were there. And she became a theorist and wrote a book on Shostakovich. It's an excellent book. This book, Seth Brodsky wrote a book called from 1989, or European Music and the Modernist Unconscious. I just think it's a masterpiece. It's all about modernism, but from a Lacanian point of view. So there are some works on this. Okay. Don't worry about this slide for a second. I think if I had to say, like, to an everyday person, what did Lacan do? Basically, Lacan developed a different model of subjectivity, of what a person is. So if I go down the street, if I just talk to anyone, probably in most cultures, except maybe some Asian cultures, and said, well, how does it work? They know what the unconscious is, and they know what, the outside world is. And if I said, what does the word subjectivity mean? And they would probably say something like, and I ask this of my students, and they generally answer this way, oh, those are all like the crazy thoughts that are in our head, and they have nothing to do with the real world. They're just like, it's totally fanciful, and it doesn't have any connection with the outside world. But I know better, and my thoughts inside have nothing to do with what's outside, and there's this hard division between what's inside me and what's outside of me. And that's the kind of, I think, everyday, I have a brain, I have thoughts, and those thoughts are mine, and that's what makes me original. And I think if you had to say in a couple of sentences, what's Lacan about? He's about saying, you're wrong. Basically, as you are born and as you grow up, the culture, language, and the culture becomes part of your unconscious. In fact, your unconscious in some way is the culture. And when you think that you're thinking something that is original to you, it probably isn't. It's probably something that is a problem in the culture that has come into you, because you're always taking in the culture and you're thinking through this problem, but really it's the culture that's doing thinking through you. And this is something that my students always have a hard time with, but it's something that I have bought. I'm willing to buy this idea that, so Lacan has this idea that the unconscious is what he calls the discourse of the other, which is a fancy way of saying that the unconscious is the culture. My unconscious is the culture. It's how the culture works. And I'm going to take you through how, for Lacan, we develop. So for Lacan, we are all symptomatic. That means we have symptoms, things that don't work, things that go awry, and they go awry because of the way that we are born and the way that we are brought up. So when we are born, we're in what he calls the real. The real is life. It's hard to imagine. In fact, it's impossible to imagine. The real is life as it is if you had no language or way to describe it. If you were just in the world, had no language, and went around trying to figure out where you were, you'd be in the real. And it's usually traumatic. So why do babies cry so much? They have no idea where they are. They don't know who they are. They don't know that they're, there's a book called Oneness and Separateness. They don't know if they're part of everything, if they're separate from everything. They don't even know that they're a person. They are just in the real. They have no idea what's going on. And this is the first crisis that we all go through. This has some very fascinating ramifications that you find even outside of Lacan. This one I love. Judith Butler writes, "I am not in control of my own story. And I am not in control of the things that I do." And why is this, she tells us? Because when I am born, I don't have language. I don't have a way to think through who I am and what I am. And by the time, and Lacan basically says this too, by the time I gain language, it's already too late. I've already been formed by all sorts of things. And not only that, I can't control my end. My story isn't done until I die, but I can't stay around to report on that. So I cannot report on my beginning and how that all worked, and I can't report on my end. Only other people can do that for me, and they would have to live longer than me if they want to do the whole story, but even then they can't do it because they can't go inside of who I was when I first came out into the world and kind of take apart whatever it was that was going on in my brain or your brain when we're born. I'm sorry, that was a long thing. Our next step is we learn to think in images. This is called the imaginary. We have here that moment when the child realizes that they are separate. The child learns at a certain point, and Lacan is not, this has been proven. Lacan, he says this, but later, not proven, but they've done experiments about this. At a certain point in a young child's life, they finally realize that they're separate from the rest of the world. I actually remember that point in my life. I don't know why, but I remember the point when I said, "Oh, right, I'm different from everybody else." I was about 2. But I just remember all of these things from when I was young, which I think is why. If you've raised children, this definitely happened to my daughter. When you enter the imaginary, you start to dream, which is thinking in images. This tends to freak babies out. So you think, we were like, yes, my daughter's now 24, so we don't have this problem anymore. But we were like, oh my God, my daughter won't sleep, she won't sleep. And then finally she gets to sleep for about a year, and then dreams start, and the dreams wake her up because they're freaking her out. What's going on with all these? And oh, geez, now I have to put this baby back to sleep again. And this is a sign that she had entered the imaginary. It's in the imaginary that that desire and all sorts of things start to develop. Because what we all want, according to Lacan, is to go back. We want to go back to this time when mommy took care of us, when everything was taken care of for us and we didn't have to do any of the work. And in the imaginary, this is literally where dreams are born. I'm going to do the musical part to this right away. So there's a musical correlate to this, and it's by, it's actually was first kind of developed by film scholars, but there's an excellent book that I listed in the PowerPoint by Kaya Silverman, and it's called The Acoustic Mirror. And what she says is that not only do babies learn to see things at this stage, they learn to separate themselves from the sounds that are around them. They learn that the sounds they're making with their mouth are the sounds that they are making with their mouth. And that the sound of the mother's voice becomes an object of desire. And so that one thing that I often do in classes to illustrate this is play Daybreak from Daphnis and Chloe. And if you have that in your head, the sound just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I'm getting them right now, goosebumps just thinking about it. I get these goosebumps of wow, I'm surrounded by sound and it's just so glorious. And for Silverman, she says, you're basically reliving this moment in your life when you were surrounded by the sound of your mother's voice, and that was the sound of pleasure to you. So music belongs to, in some sense, in fact, it belongs to all three, but it belongs to the imaginary. It's this thing that surrounds us and that we love, and it's kind of focuses desire for us. And then comes the symbolic. The symbolic is language. So now, the crisis of the imaginary is that I realize I'm separate and I have to take care of myself. The crisis of the symbolic is, I have to learn this language. And again, raising a child, I remember this. I don't know if any of you had this experience raising children. They get to a point where they know a couple of words, but they also point a lot, and you say, use your words. And then they get all frustrated. What's the word for that thing? I don't know. And then you say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to give it to you, and tell me what that word is. And they, I need the ketchup. All right, good. Here's your ketchup. So this is a crisis for us. We have to learn a language that is there before us. We don't get to create the language. We don't get to pick. I mean, if I picked, I would probably pick French. Please, can I come out and speak French and live in Paris? No, I didn't get to pick that. So language is kind of imposed upon us, and this is our last crisis. The question that might come then, and then the real comes back. Sorry, it's very complicated. The language cannot cover everything. It's not perfect at explaining things to us. There are all these experiences we have in our life that can't be covered by language, that language is just inadequate for. I think music is one of those things. We always feel like words are inadequate to describe our experiences of music. And in some sense, for Lacan, we are confronting the real. We are confronting a thing that language can't cover, and this is a problem. Very often for Lacan, in fact, this is the only things he tends to write about in the second reel, the real is traumatic. I face some weird experience that I just can't integrate into my thinking, some trauma or some weird event that I just don't have the words to explain. And because I don't have the words to explain, it doesn't fit within inside me. So this is a symptomatic structure because at every point as we're growing up, we are experiencing little traumas because we have to move from one stage to the next. Okay. We get a bunch of, I better move along here. I'm almost at my hour, and Rodolfo's going to kick me out. There are a number of very famous statements by Lacan that seem just not to make sense unless you know kind of what he's thinking. One I've already told you, the unconscious is the discourse of the other. This is basically saying my unconscious is created by my culture. The letter always arrives at its destination. This is one that concerns agency. So the way I put it is, Prokofiev did not write his sonata for me. I am not the person that he wrote it for. But just by picking up Prokofiev's letter, his music, it becomes mine. It becomes a letter that Prokofiev has written to me. And that letter is the form of a question. It's a form of a question that the music is demanding that I answer. The problem is I don't know what the question is, and I don't know what the answer is. It's scratching like the back of my head all the time. And we get these kinds of letters all the time when we read poetry, when we read books, when we think someone is talking to us in a crowd and it turns out they're talking to someone else, but we were hearing the whole thing as it was addressed to us because we always feel like everything revolves around us and that these questions are coming at us. And this one I just love. I think where I am not, therefore I am where I do not think. This is his twist on I think, therefore I am. So he says, you don't think where you are. The culture is doing the thinking. It just happens to be doing it partly through you. So I think where I am not. I'm sitting here, but I'm actually thinking the culture is doing some thinking. So I'm not where the thinking is happening. People hate that. They're like, well, of course I'm doing the thinking. Are you really? Therefore, well, my freshmen definitely are not doing any of the thinking. Therefore, I am where I do not think. Therefore, in some sense, I'm not just here in my body, I'm also out in the culture. And in fact, right now is the perfect example. I am talking to you in Brazil, but I am not physically there. So in some sense, I am where you are, but I'm not where you are. And so our sense of where we are and who we are is it's much more dispersed and much more fragmented in a good way, actually, than people tend to think. Okay, so I've decided to consider the pitch class motive as a symptom. Now I'm just basically gonna go right to the music again, so that I can finish and you don't hate me. So what happens with a symptom? A symptom is just a sign. But for Lacan, let's think about this medically. I go to a regular medical doctor, and I have a fever, and I have a cough, and I have a stuffy nose, and those are my symptoms. Each of those are a sign. And my doctor reads those signs and says, oh, well, you have a flu, so go home and drink some water, and you'll be fine, and just rest. And so he has read my symptoms, he knows what to tell me, and off I go. But I go to a psychiatrist and I say, I get nervous every time I see a dog, and he can't say, well, that's because when you were 2, that's a sign, but we have to uncover that sign, that symptom. And an example that I give is in the book, in my last book, is, let's say I'm a pianist and I have a fear of forgetting, and I go to a psychiatrist. I have a fear that I'm going to have a memory slip while I'm practicing. And he might say, all right, so that's not really your fear. Your fear is something else. That fear is covering another fear. What could it be? And then I might do some word associations and say, well, I play keys. Oh, right, keys. So maybe key is a symptom. And do I have a symptom with a key? And I might say, actually, I'm always afraid that I've lost that I haven't brought my keys into my pocket when I leave the house. And actually, this why I came up with this is I actually do have this fear. So, and then he might say, oh, that's interesting. Well, why do you think you have that fear? And I might say, well, I don't want to be locked out. Well, why do you think you don't want to be locked out? There must be something else. Oh, well, maybe it's that I feel like I'm separate from other people and I'm always being locked out of other conversations. Aha! So that's what the problem is. It isn't that you're afraid of forgetting, it's that you're afraid that you're being left out of things. And if you kept going, you could go on forever, like uncovering this symptom and interpreting it. At a certain point, I know that I think Ilza asked this question, like, when does the interpretation stop? Like, that's a good question. At a certain point, if you keep digging and digging, you'll come up with emptiness. You'll come up with that the sign is empty for Lacan. So I just want to go through these things and oh, there's a question. Go ahead.
Who is questioning?
I thought that I saw Carol with the...
No. Well, go ahead. I don't think that
Okay,
was a mistake.
All right. So I just need one more little piece, and then I'll just very quickly go through the Prokofiev. So Lacan has this idea that symptoms do not come from the past, but they come from the future. And you're like, this makes no sense. Well, how could this be? So where does this come up? Where does this come from? In the Freudian tradition, if I have a symptom, of course I want to uncover, but I'm always looking for that traumatic event that happened, what he calls the primal scene, the traumatic event that happened when I was young that caused me to have this anxiety. In fact, Freud actually writes about his own traumatic event, and it's when he was very small and he heard his father said, that boy will amount to nothing. And so that was a symptom that he carried throughout his life. Lacan says, actually, it could be anything. And we won't know which of the traumatic things that happened to you as you were a child, which of those things kind of blossom until you get older, until you're in the future. And then in the future, you'll say, oh, I have this problem. And then you look to the past. The past didn't, in some weird sense, did not create the symptom. It's the future that created the symptom because you didn't integrate it in some way as you were going along through your life. So you might have been wondering, well, there's so many chromatic pitches in here. Why isn't he talking about those other ones? So here's one. We have two other chromatic pitches. And from a Lacanian point of view, you could say that the D sharp is hiding something else. It's hiding this. I'm so focused on that D sharp that I'm not focused on these two pitches. And I might say, hold it, do those pitches come back too? And guess what? They do. But we'll go on. I'll get through this quickly. And I say to myself, oh, look. The next time I get a note that really sticks out, it's that F sharp again. And so, hold it, that D sharp was actually hiding another thing. I was so focused on the D sharp that I didn't notice that there were other things in my way. And then I get to this section. Right, where the D flat gets me to a kind of dominant. The D sharp doesn't function at all in this section. So I'm starting to think, oh, there's another symptom underneath the first one. And I can trace that all the way through if I want to. I'm not going to. But this thing about the symptom coming from the future, why did I pick the D sharp? Not because it was first, but because by the end of the piece, it is what is remaining. Those E flat major chords are what are remaining, and they are pounding through to the end. So in some sense, the symptom didn't come from the beginning. It came from the end. It's at the end of the piece that I figure out, oh, this is the big problem in the piece. So what could the problem mean? I list a whole lot of things here, but I'm just going to go through a couple of them. The first thing is this kind of fairy tale tune. It never gets to come back in the big glorious version that like Mahler might give us or Tchaikovsky. And this is a problem or a symptom of the imaginary, this fairy tale tune that never a desire that never gets fulfilled. In the symbolic, there are a lot of things, but a couple of people asked about this, so I'm just going to throw it out. In one way, you could say that Prokofiev himself was a symptom. He's a symptom of his culture or of what doesn't work in the Soviet system. So you could think of tonality in some sense as the Soviet system because they wanted composers to write tonally, and he's refusing. He's a symptom, and I'm not going to do this. These are these notes that aren't going to fit, and I'm going to make them not fit. And then there's like I'll finish with this. Lacan has this thing where he says that we become our symptom. So what does that mean? My symptom in some sense drives me all the way through my life. So I'm always trying to interpret it. But in some sense, without the symptom, I'm nothing. The symptom is what drives me. It's what drives interpretation. It's what drives, me trying to figure out myself. So in some sense, if I had a piece that went like this, you'd think, well, that's a dumb piece. There's nothing to it. It's only when the D sharp is there. Then you go, oh, that's really cool. If the ending of the piece were you'd say, well, that's just an A minor chord. But he plays. And it's the E flat that gives the piece its identity in some sense. And the fact that we struggle with the E flat is what makes us come back to the piece over and over. I'm going to stop because I've gone on too long. Oh, sorry, I'm not going to stop. I told you that if you go through the signs, eventually you get to emptiness. The ending of this piece goes like this. Big major chord. I don't hear any triumph in that. It's sort of like he's emptied out the tonal system, and I can end it any way I want. It really doesn't matter because the tonal system is sort of, he's emptying it and of its meaning. All right, there's supposed to be the word obrigado here, but there isn't. I'm sorry, and I'm finished. So I'm sorry I went over. So I was being Brazilian. I was being Polish and Brazilian at the same time. I didn't follow the time I was given. So thank you for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see all of you.
Good.
By the way, did my student ever come? No. I'm going to fail them now.
Okay. So thank you very much, Michael, for a wonderful talk. I'm sorry that I think you should talk for one more hour to explain everything that you had to say about this piece. I think was actually you shortened your thoughts to comply with the schedule that I gave you. So yes, I ask sorry.
No. I don't want to bore people, so.
Okay. So let's start now with the questions, and we can proceed with the dialogue with you and the guests that will ask you. And later, if the other assistants, people that are watching, wants to participate, they are welcome also to formulate some questions on the spot. So I will share the screen. And I will present. So this is the question of Ilse. Ilse, can you talk, please?
You want me to read it?
Are you seeing the do you see that?
Yeah.
Okay, so go ahead.
Well, let me just go to my first question. And I read in your paper that I'm sorry that I don't see the whole thing because let's see if I can. I just have a picture over my text. But now, okay. I read in your paper that even the most superior text is a product of culture. That Lacan considers artistic texts as ideological, that the symbolic themes grew out. How would you trace this thought specifically with Prokofiev Sonata? You want me to read the 3 questions?
No, just the first one. And Michael, you need to turn on your microphone.
Oh, sorry. So I really like this question. It's quite difficult to answer. But I have 2 answers for you. So in the first case, sorry, there's a fly in front of me. In the first case, one would really need to know Prokofiev's culture. In some sense, one would have to know Prokofiev better than Prokofiev knew himself to be able to understand how the symbolic is working through the sonata. In another sense, though, what is happening, and this is how I take it, this idea that the text is addressed to me, whether or not Prokofiev knew it. In another sense, what I can do is use the Prokofiev sonata to think through the ideological problems that are in my own culture. So and I find it pretty striking. I don't remember if I mentioned it in the paper. I didn't mention it today. I find it pretty striking that Prokofiev was a Ukrainian composer, and the Ukraine International Airport is called the Prokofiev Airport, and they are now at war with Russia. And in some sense, I can think of this sonata as, in a strange way, addressed to that particular war too. What is going on between these two countries that there's an ideological problem? And it seems simplistic to say, but the ideological problem, and one that I think Prokofiev also was dealing with, was this idea of how much freedom a person has within their culture. Now, you could say, how much freedom does someone have in the Soviet system? How much freedom does someone have in the American system? I don't think that's the proper question, though. So I'm going to use a little more critical theory. So there is a Marxist named Althusser who tries to explain how it is that we become members of our culture, and why it is that we rarely, except for academics, and this is why everyone hates academics, why is it that we rarely question our culture? Why is it that we go along with things? And his term for that is interpolation. And he says the culture is constantly turning us in, or making us become a worker that will work in the capitalist machine, or in any machine that we live in, whether it be capitalist or socialist or whatever. And we personally will always feel like that system doesn't work for us, but in some sense we're forced to work within it. So this is the kind of ideological problem that I think this particular sonata opens up. There's a problem. I'm a symptom in my culture, and that symptom seems to be getting worse. I don't know how things are in Brazil, but in the US, I definitely have this feeling that things are not getting better, that the ideological, ideology that's been running around, the neoliberal ideology, is only making things worse. It's not making things better. So in some strange sense, this sonata speaks to me because it's doing the same thing. It introduces a little problem, and the problem gets worse and worse as things go on, and the problem is just never solved. So those are my two answers to that. The first one is the musicological answer, is that I really need to know Prokofiev's culture and pretty much everything about the ideology that's going on in his culture, to be able to speak about that text in terms of the symbolic. But I can also speak about that text in terms of me picking it up and what it means to me in my culture. So those would be my answers, such as they are.
Second question, Yusuf.
Thank you.
I'm still listening. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. My second question is about the tripartite model of the fragmented subjectivity, the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. Mm-hmm. I ask if this model could be addressed to music as well, so that the composer or composition, so the work as it is, the interpreter or interpretation, the child turned independent from the mother, the composer, and the listener or listening, from which music as a signifier depends, could explain music as an impossible wholeness.
Yes, my favorite part about this question, Rodolfo sent me questions in advance so I could think about them, or some questions. My favorite part about this question is the impossible wholeness. I think that people often use music, and in fact, historically, in the 19th century in Europe, music is held up as this kind of transcendental object, and that in the act of listening to music, I kind of transcend myself. So I love that term, and I think I'm going to steal it, but I'll cite you. I love that term, impossible wholeness. There's a kind of impossible wholeness to music. Now, I'll get to the other parts in a second. What's going on then is, in some sense, in this piece, and in many modernist pieces, composers are saying, no, music isn't whole. I'm showing, I mean, I love music, and I you know, in some sense, I'm talking as a composer. I love music, and it's beautiful, but it comes from someone and something that is fragmented. So it also is fragmented. This is why I personally why I'm opposed to making all the parts fit in an analysis. You know, you do an analysis and there's always those notes that don't fit, and so, well, I'll ignore those, or I'll come up with some theory to make it all fit. It's not all supposed to fit. You know, or just thinking about Schoenberg, and you have this 12-tone system, and then you ask, hold it, so how come he doesn't follow this system that he came up with? How come we have this whole passage here where I can't figure out which part of the row he's using? Well, maybe the row wasn't as important as you thought it was, or maybe Schoenberg was like, that the wholeness that he sought in music was like an impossibility. I've thought long and hard about the first part of your question. I don't have a good answer. I think it's better to, just for me, I think it's better not to separate out each of these parts of music, the composer, the music, and the listener, and map them onto parts of the Lacanian tripart system. I think it's better to recognize that we take music as a kind of subjectivity. And so it's a subject. We take the composer as a subjectivity. So the composer is a subject, the listener is a subject, and these various subjectivities all bring with them the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, and they're all kind of meshed together. I like that you used the word tripart, because that comes from Molino and Nautier, and as I'm sure you know, and that's just purely semiotic. It's not Lacanian, but his major thing is that we're never really truly understood, because the signifiers I use, in the tripart system, I come up with signifiers. There they are. You pick up the signifiers and you interpret them in a particular way. So communication is always, askew. Well, if you use the Lacanian model, the whole thing is a mess. But life, I actually prefer that, because I find life pretty messy, and music pretty messy, and people pretty messy. So, but I prefer that, because I prefer that to hearing where I'd be like, hold it, are you a composer or not? So that's my answer to that. I love impossible wholeness, so I'm taking that.
So my
Further question?
And now finally, since nobody is whole, and that is why we are here together trying to get our thoughts about music into shape, would you consider your analysis as part of a thought that travels through our minds as a never incomplete product?
Yeah, I love this question too. The simple answer is yes. I love that quote, which I must have had in the paper, and I don't remember putting there, but it's from Lacan. He says nobody is whole, and that's why we're all here trying to figure things out. So Lacan's thought can seem very off-putting and very almost tragic in a way, that we're not whole. But there's a large hope involved in it, and that is that the only way to get along is for all of us to get together as we are today and discuss our thoughts about something. Now, those thoughts will always be an incomplete product, but that's okay, because if it was ever complete, we'd be whole, and then we would just, as Lacan puts it, if we were whole, we'd all be just sitting in our corners being whole. We would have no reason to speak to one another. So there's a kind of beauty to it. It reminds me of Buddhism, actually, because Buddhism has the same idea where at the center there's nothing. But the reason that's a gift is that it forces us all to figure out and create the world around this nothingness, which is supposed to be a positive thought. But I love that third question. Yeah, and my answer is yes.
So thank you very much for your incomplete questions. Cool.
Yes. Thank you. You're so clever.
So next guest is Carol. Carol, do you have the microphone now?
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed so much this afternoon and reading your paper. It took me a while, and then I finally got it, and so it was a big pleasure. And I remember the first time that you came 8 years ago. Also, I remember. So
thank you.
It was very nice.
I myself there. I cannot tell you that was my favorite conference, I think, ever, because everyone there was so kind, but also shared their thoughts. I'm sorry to interrupt your question.
I even remember what you were talking about. It was about Over the Rainbow.
Yes, that's right. Oh, and I have a story about that. After you're finished with your question, I have to tell you a story about the Over the Rainbow.
Yes, but I have another question that I did not write, and which is less important, or I mean less. Why? It's about analysis, and I followed your essay very carefully, and I thought it was brilliant. I enjoyed it very much, and your explanation of Lacan it's not difficult to grasp, which is unusual. So you have the domain of the subject that you can translate it to everybody. So I thank you very much for that effort also. And I have one question. Before I start reading my part, what I wrote here is why not why the theme, the first theme of the first movement, which I think is the strongest of everything. You know, like the beginning is so strong of the sonata.
Yeah.
It comes in the last, before the coda, which is like just nothing.
Yeah.
So my question would be, but I'm not asking you, how come it comes back so strongly? And it's a whole completely different ambient. You are in a different world, and then you remember that the first theme is always there.
Oh, that's a beautiful question, actually. And the problem with doing the whole sonata is that it takes a long time.
No, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm just observing that.
So for those who don't know the whole sonata, it starts this way. Right. And there's the D sharp right at the beginning. And so this little symptom that I was talking about, it's in the first bar of the first measure of the first movement. And
that's what I was trying to figure out. It's there in the first measure.
I think that's why it comes back, because if you go through the whole sonata, the D sharp doesn't play much of a role in the middle two movements, but then in the last movement it comes back, and then he brings back, like you said, the first theme of the first movement.
Yeah.
And the first theme is the one where that D sharp first interrupts. It just doesn't belong there.
And it's just like somebody hitting something.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I think it's so fabulous.
Yeah,
music.
I think the fabulous sonata, and you may have been the one. Someone wrote, that it's a fantastic piece. I think it's just an amazing piece, and so anyway, but go ahead. Yeah.
So I wrote this. I'm going to read. Every time I am invited to discuss a paper or to be in a board to evaluate music students, I'm amazed by the power of music. Like everything that I do is like it's like I'm drawn to music.
Hmm.
And then it's difficult to separate from it and start the work that you did, which is amazing. So this is a question that's not written. How do you choose?
What am I choosing? Give me my choices. Chocolate or vanilla. I'll take vanilla.
I mean, what brought you to the D sharp? I think
Well,
it's intuition that does that.
yeah,
Like, do you
yes,
haven't, what?
I agree totally. I mean, this is something I think we all discover as teachers. There's certain things you cannot teach someone how to do. Um, so, especially if you teach interpretation or if you teach, semiotics, you, I like the way you said intuition, um, because you just have an intuition about it, and it's really hard to explain to people why you had this intuition. And then students go, "Well, how do I get it?" Although I'll give you an answer that Kofi Agawu once gave to one of my students. So uh, I was teaching a course on semiotics, and we talked about musical topics. And a student, Kofi Ogawa, came as a guest, and a student asked him, said something like, "I have a real hard time hearing these topics. How do I learn them?" And and he was expecting that Kofi would say, "Well, read this book and that book." But what he said was, "Well, I think you should listen to every work of music by Sammartini, by Haydn, by Mozart, by Beethoven, and he went on, and it was all by Koch, by J.C. Bach, and he listed so many composers in the 18th century. And then he said, if you listen to all that music, you won't have to ask me what a topic is." So, in some sense, you know, I mean, this is what we do as scholars. I'm like you. Like any kind of music, I'm like, oh my God, this is so fantastic. How does this work? And then I go and I listen to 500 pieces. Uh, I'm sure people there are like this. I'm like this with authors too. I read a book by an author. I'm like, oh, I have to read everything by this guy now,
Yes, just
or
exactly.
woman,
Yeah, yeah.
and I read all of it. And then suddenly the first book that I read makes totally more different sense because I've read all the others. And um, so, yeah, how do you choose? I think it is just intuition, and that, since I'm a pianist, I play a lot of Prokofiev. And so um, I've been
Uh-huh.
playing this piece. This is sad how old I am. I've been playing this piece literally for 45 years.
Well,
So
fantastic,
in
fantastic.
my head, and
Yeah.
you
So
know,
it came to your mind, everything. Yeah.
yeah, it just, I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
you know,
Uh, so I'm going to read the end of what I wrote.
yeah,
Yes, here we are dealing with two modes of listening: extracting music content from music signifiers
mhm,
and extracting, by should be better, life's content from verbal signifiers,
mhm,
because both Lacan and uh, they both used what people told them.
mhm,
It was all verbal signs.
yeah,
Yes, this is the beauty of it.
mhm,
Like you get access by words and you get access by music signs.
yeah,
Huh? Both movements are not complete. Only silence or death can interrupt them. In life, all we learn is through the symbolic language. Is it the same for music? How can an interpretation be interrupted?
yeah,
This is a problem for me also. Well,
yeah.
yeah.
So, well, the second one, for me, is actually easier to answer than the first one. So, actually, Freud had the same question in an essay that he calls Analysis terminable and interminable. And he says, you know what? I have some patients, I could just sit and do analysis with them for their whole lives and they'll never get better, right? And he puzzles over this. And he just says, you know, at a certain point, you just have to stop. So, you know, I could, maybe not with this piece, but let's say, you know, Mahler's Sixth Symphony. I could spend the rest of my life coming up with interpretations for Mahler's Sixth Symphony, but I want my life not to be spent just on one piece. So, what is interpretation for? This I learned from Larry Kramer. He says, you know, the point of an interpretation is to spur other interpretations. So, the point of an interpretation that I may offer to you is not for you to say, oh, that was right, or oh, that was wrong, but to say, well, hold it, I can hear it that way, but I can also hear it this way, and that you then kind of pick up the interpretation and take it, or you just drop it and say, this isn't for me. So there is no end to interpretation. It's only interrupted because you simply stop. It's
Yeah.
I don't want to make light of this, but it's almost like I have a student now writing his dissertation, and just more and more keeps coming out, and I have to tell him, look, just stop. You just need to say, you cannot tell us everything you know. That's not what your job is. It's your job to decide, I'm going to stop here. And if he doesn't do it, this is funny, if he doesn't, I just warned him through an email. I said, I don't want any more writing. I want you to take what you have and find 5 chapters in there, and that's your dissertation. And he wrote back, I can't do it. And I said, well, then you'll never pass. So yeah, we have this impulse to just go and go and go and go. But at a certain point, we just have to say the interpretation is done, even though it never is.
Yeah, sure. But
Your question
it's a
about-
difficult task, you know, you have to stop.
Yes, that's right. It is difficult. It also reminds me, I'm sorry that, you know, a lot of these things are just anecdotal. But I remember, I think a lot of people have this experience when they're young. I remember when I was young, I would go into my room and I would listen to the same piece like 1,000 times. Like, you know, this is why I mentioned Mahler 6. I remember falling in love with Mahler 6. I would play it all the way through, and then I would play it again. And then the next day I would play it again, and I'd play it again, and play it again. And I didn't even want to hear other music. I did, this piece is it for me. And then at some point I was just like, okay, I'm done with this. I have to move on. But there's a way in which music is just so, I think, does that to us, you know, at least to me. So in life, so both movements are not complete, only sounds are dead. There was a first part. What was the first part? Oh,
No, I think it's okay.
yeah. Extracting.
It's okay for me.
Oh, okay.
I'm satisfied, and also I had a second second meeting, and so maybe I'll have to leave before the end.
It's fine. Yeah,
It's
fine.
okay, but it was a big pleasure to be here and listen and read your paper. It was really wonderful, wonderful experience. Thank you very much.
Michael, you are not done. You didn't.
I know I'm not done.
No, you missed the over the rainbow part.
Oh, right. So over the rainbow. So I gave it. Yeah.
We had a long time of conversation about it.
Yeah. So
8 years ago.
I don't remember who it was, but there was someone who was at that conference after I talked about Over the Rainbow, and they said, well, this song is about pedophilia. And I at first didn't buy it, and then they said, oh, no. You know, Judy Garland is like this young woman who's being sold like from America across to other countries. And then I forget who it was, but it was a man.
It was Paulo Costa Lima.
Oh, was it? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember.
It was great. And then he said, and who are you in this scenario? And I couldn't figure it out. And he said, well, you're the dog. Because in the scene, she pets the dog. And I just thought it was so wonderful. So the next time I gave that talk, I said, one reading for this is that the whole thing is about pedophilia. Oh my God. The entire audience, they were just like, what? How can you say that about this? This is like this perfect piece. And I said, well, I got this interpretation in Brazil. And you might understand that if you're a Brazilian watching this movie, you're seeing American culture being thrown at you. If you're an American, of course you're going to say, oh, it's a perfect movie. But I said, no, when you think about Judy Garland's life, she forever had to be that pre-sexual woman because that's what we identified her as when she first sang. And they always asked her to sing Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and it was never as good as that first time because she grew up. And so there couldn't be that that kind of pedophilia that went with it. They were not buying it at all. But then the other part is I still teach that song and I teach various versions of the song. And this just happened a year ago. I taught a course on hermeneutics and I showed that song. And I said, what do you think this song is about other than wishing to be over the rainbow? And a young woman raised her hand and said, I think it's about pedophilia. And I was like, oh my gosh, like Lacan was right. Two people from two different places at two different ages, two whatevers, both thought, and I was like, you're right. Like, why is this about pedophilia? And she said, well, we're supposed to fall in love with this young woman who is pre-sexual, and we do fall in love with her, and she's talking about this magical place, and she's the magical place, and it was just beautiful how it all worked out. And so I've used that interpretation before, and with adults, no, but with young people, they got it. So that's the story, such as it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So this leads us to Paulo Lima, that made the observation about over the rainbow, interpretation about over the rainbow, and now
Oh, okay.
and now he's not here.
Yeah.
But I don't think he is here. Paulo, are you here? No, I don't think so. He had a problem of connection, internet connection. So I will read his question for you. Both Freud and Lacan work with the model of four destinations for the drives, the instinct, repression, and this will lead to symptom formation, return to the ego, transformation into the opposite, and sublimation, many times associated to artistic creation and not involving repression. Why should we try to understand Prokofiev's symbolic production, namely the Sixth Sonata, as a symptom formation involving repression and not as sublimation?
Yeah, that question, since you sent the question in advance, I thought to myself, I'm really glad he sent me this question in advance because I went and did some reading to be able to answer this question. I, first of all, as background, Lacan, his writings exist in about 28 volumes of essays, and then a big thick volume of essays. And I've not been through all of them. I don't think my life is long enough. So there are always people smarter than me, like Paulo, who know something that I don't about Lacan. And so I went and I looked this up. So it can be understood as sublimation. So what does sublimation mean to Lacan? In his he tends to kind of change what he thinks, as it goes along, as all of us do. But in the end, sublimation is a signifier that becomes like an object. It's so important to us that it takes on the aspect or the status of an object, of an actual thing. So, and this is why it's associated with artistic creation, that in this case, musical signifiers become so important to a composer that they actually create a thing out of those signifiers. Yes, we can understand this as as Prokofiev's act of sublimation. But after that, I still, and it doesn't have to be, it wouldn't have to interpret these as symptoms. It's hard for me not to interpret them as symptoms, but if we do interpretation, we could do not simple, but we could do interpretation with Lacan and just realize that an interpretation is you never get to the end. In other words, that eventually there'll be layer upon layer upon layer, and you could get rid of the idea of symptom altogether. For me, it's just that there aren't that many actually. The Brahms is another one that I told you about, the F minor clarinet sonata. That's one where the motive just kind of takes over the piece, and that's why for me I go to a symptomatic approach. I'm sorry that I'm going on so long, but it also has something to do with agency. So, and this is a very big thing with Lacan and later for Althusser. We tend to think of ourselves as free agents that do actions on our own. I've made a decision, I'm going to do this thing, and then I do it. But for Lacan and for Althusser, often those decisions are made for us in advance. And now, what does this have to do with music? We might think of Prokofiev as knowing exactly what he's doing when he's writing this sonata, and even thinking, I'm going to use this D sharp as a recurring thing. But it could very well be that the D sharp, in some sense, took over the piece. Now, this doesn't make any sense, but at first. But when you think about, I listen to a lot of authors talk about their work, and a common theme comes up with authors, and the theme is this. They'll say, well, I wanted the character to be like this when I started to write, but then the character sort of took over and wanted to go in a different way, so I let the character go in that way. If you think in the terms of agency, it makes no sense. Well, you're the author, just make the character any way you want. But in some sense, these authors are right. The character is representing something in the culture, and it wants to go in a particular way, and it's making the author create it in a way that the author hadn't even thought of. So musically, what that means is that often a composer may have no idea about why a certain thing happens over and over and over. It is just happening. The music is, in some sense, composing them. And I'll just stop with that. Hopefully when he sees this, he won't scream and send me an email that I'm totally wrong. Or maybe he will. That would be actually better if he would tell me where I got that wrong. So.
Okay, let's go for the last question. Oh boy.
This one I think is a video, yes.
Yeah, but you should be able. Oh, there you go. I will skip the beginning because he makes some comments. I will try to go directly to the point.
Dr. Rodolfo Coelho de Souza, Lacan's concept to work where he articulates
Here.
to participate in this TeMA activity.
Okay, there you go.
Today, the participation of Dr. Michael Klein with an excellent work where he articulates in a precise way Lacan's concept to interpret a musical work by Sergei Prokofiev. If you are watching the recording on my commentary and question, it is because I was not able to connect due to a prior family engagement on the same date and time, where I will be in a farm in the countryside of São Paulo. I would like to congratulate Dr. Michael Klein for applying Lacan's theory of the symptom to problems related the creative process in musical composition. I really like the ideas in his paper, especially that Prokofiev's piano sonata number 6 is a leader or music for times of war, and in that sense, also a leader for our time, the time of between Russia and Ukraine. At the end of the article, Dr. Klein tonight definitively presents the thesis that the pitch class motif in the sonata is a symptom, that is, a disturbance, a disruption, an element that causes disorder in a particular symbolic order, a term used by Lacan or in a musical symbolic system. Similarly, he calls that the symptom is a substitute for something to be deciphered. I would add the symptom is a formation of the unconscious. For Freud, the unconscious is the physical background responsible for both pathogenic and the creative phenomena. From the pathologic point of view, the symptom is a foreign body, a system infiltrated in the network of memories, which Lacan names signifier network. Faced with this foreign body, many subjects defend that self through seek process. One of the main defense process described by Freud was symptom repression. This is not the case with Prokofiev. He gives the symptom another face. He sublimates, transmutes, reintegrates the symptom into a symbolic musical order. His work presents used with the thesis that the pitch class motive and Prokofiev is a symptom. Therefore, this pitch class motive is the expression of Prokofiev's unconscious. Klein defends this argument in another way when relates facts from the social.
Rodolfo, it's muted now. I think you muted your microphone and then the sound's not coming out.
Okay, sorry. I think it's not working this way. I will interrupt this sharing, and I will ask Michael. You heard this video before.
Yes.
Can you synthesize the question and give the answer for us? I think it's.
All right. So I think the question was a bit similar to Paulo's question. That he asks. First of all, he mentions that he liked the idea that Prokofiev himself is a symptom, so I was glad that he liked that, since he, is a Lacanian. And then he also was talking about this at the part that we just heard, that part of the process of going through psychoanalysis is to take the symptom and integrate it into yourself. So one thing that he seemed to think that worked was that that at various points in this piece, the music seems to be wanting to integrate that symptom into itself, but then it just never happens. If I understood the question properly, though, at the end, he brought up the term sublimation again. So, I mean, not again, but like as in the previous question, and that was that had I considered, sublimation as a kind of avenue to explore the piece. And to be honest, as I was before, I had not read much about sublimation in Lacan. So I did some digging today and came up with a kind of preliminary answer. But I'm sorry to say I don't have a good answer for this, except that I'm glad that I was asked the question, because now I need to go and do some more research on sublimation, because it is possible to read the piece without using the idea of the symptom. So there were sort of two sides to what I heard when I listened to it today. And the first was that, well, yes, parts of the analysis worked, especially the integrating things into, integrating the pitch into the piece and then it not being integrated. But then the question came up of like, in what way does sublimation take a part in this? And I just don't have a good answer for that right now. But I am happy for the question, because now I know where to go. I'm always happy when a Lacanian asks me a question, because, they'll say like, well, in seminar 14, page 2, chapter 5, he says this. And I go, oh, okay, I guess I better go read that now. So I thank him for the question, because now I need to go and do some more work on
I must remember for the audience, other members of the TeMA, that he's not a musician, a professional musician. He's an amateur, but he's a professional analyst, a Lacanian analyst, and I had a professor at the University of Espírito Santo, where he teaches in psychology, and but he has been in our meetings or other meetings of music many times. He's very interested in music and psychoanalysis. And then I ask you a final question concerning this approach of sublimation. To reach a progress in any psychoanalysis, you need to put the subject on a state of association. So when you analyze Prokofiev music, are you sure that you are analyzing Prokofiev, because he's not doing any association? He's dead. What are you doing when you do that? Is a self-analysis? What is?
That's a really good question, and it's one that dogs me. So I have a couple of answers to that. Yes, so you're right. The only way for the psychoanalysis of this piece to be of any use to Prokofiev would be if he were on the couch and I could ask him questions, right? And then he goes through that process himself, right? So in that sense, right, I'm not psychoanalyzing Prokofiev. And then, I mean, you've already figured it out. So who are you psychoanalyzing then? Well, I'm psychoanalyzing myself, right? Clearly I'm projecting. But in another sense, using Lacan, I'm psychoanalyzing my culture. Like since I'm a representative of my culture and the thoughts that I have come from my culture, I'm taking this piece as a demand to be understood. So this way, if you don't mind, I'm going to back up just a second. Unlike Freud, if you've ever read Freud, he gives you analyses all the time, analyses of his patients, of books, of stories. He does that all the time. Lacan rarely analyzes anything in any of his writings. So it's hard to know how he would go about this. He usually just talks about his major thing was to train psychoanalysts. So his major thing is to explain to them, don't do this, don't do that. This thing doesn't work. This is how the subject really, how the subject really works. And in fact, one of my favorite sayings that he says is that as psychoanalysts, we cannot help our patients at all. And you think, well, gee, why am I paying for this? He says, all we can do is open the door for them. So, which basically gets back to your thing. All they can do is open a door and tell us, well, what do you see once you're in there? But they can't see it for you. And which again makes me think, well, then why am I paying all this money if I have to do all the work myself? But the typical way in which others who use Lacan, not for music, but for literature, the typical way that they approach this is they say that the work of literature or the work of art is a question that is being asked by the author, and that question is being sent out into the culture, and that they are hoping for an answer. Now, that person never gets an answer. I mean, in some sense, I mean, as a composer, maybe you can answer this, whether when you play a piece and then people respond to it or interpret it, if they ever tell you something that you were looking for, or if it's just, you know, I really loved your piece, which I think is what most of us say. What I'm doing then, and this is again how they do it in literature, I'm basically taking up what I think is the question of the piece, and I'm trying to answer that question. So the major question of the piece, in a kind of just very literal way, thinking, is what's that D sharp doing there? Like, why the D sharp? And there are some musical reasons. You can say, well, it's just a tritone axis, and he's using the tritone instead of the perfect fifth as an axis, and that's all there is to it. And you know, and then we move on. But since I think interpretively, or more interpretively, I think to myself, what question is the D sharp asking of me or of us? And I think that the answer, and I know this is kind of me reading myself, and especially since I wrote this while the Ukrainian war was starting, the piece really falls apart at the end for me. The piece just doesn't fall apart like as a piece of music, but it's about things falling apart. You know, it kind of represents a kind of chaos at the end. And so I think in a sense, the question that Prokofiev is asking is like, why is everything falling apart? You know, why am I in this world where things are just not, you know, they're just coming apart at the seams? And it's as I mentioned before, it's a question that touches me because I have the same feeling about the culture I'm in. Like, I don't know how you all think about the culture that you're in, but I think to myself, what the heck happened that, you know, American culture just is completely falling apart at the seams, and there doesn't seem to be any adults standing up to fix it. So the piece, you know, speaks to me in that way. But you're right, ultimately, you got a psychoanalysis of me when you heard this talk.
So now I open for any other participant that may want to make any question. E se alguém não conseguir falar em inglês e quiser falar em português, de a gente traduzir, também fica à vontade, tá? Pode fazer em português a pergunta e depois a gente traduz. Alguém se manifesta? Pode abrir o microfone, a câmera e fazer a pergunta.
I caught pregunta. It's the same in Spanish.
Well, may I?
Okay. Vai, Guilherme.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michael, Dr. Klein. I enjoyed very much your presentation, and I was thinking about, in terms of plot planning and the impossibility of fully conscious and rational control of the piece, and all those I'm keeping myself in what I I wrote about the question. So I come back to the beginning. In terms of plot planning and the impossibility of a fully conscious and rational control of the piece, do you think the Schenkerian concept of improvisation could somehow explain the process of composition of such complex works?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm thinking. The reason I'm thinking is that, to be honest with you, I'm not I'm not a Schenkerian. Actually, I'll relate a story. I'm sorry that I keep doing this. It involves you, Rodolfo. I remembered that you were,
Again?
yes. This is a class. I don't know. I taught Schenkerian analysis. Did you take Schenkerian analysis? I forget. Okay. Well, then it was a class that you were in that I was talking about Schenkerian analysis, and I even remember the not exactly the piece, but it was a Sarabande by Bach, and you asked a question about, like, well, where does the D sharp? It was like a leading tone, and you said, where does it resolve? And I came up with a kind of Schenkerian example and or answer, and I said, well, it resolves 3 bars later up in the soprano, and you said, I don't hear that at all, and you were like, that just doesn't work for me. And I definitely remember it was you. And at the time, I thought, well, I guess I'm not explaining it well. But I've taught Schenker a number of times, and I just think that there's a lot of there are a lot of places where he asks us to accept things that I'm now unwilling to accept. So certain resolutions of things where he finds resolutions 5 bars later or 10 bars later, I just can't accept. And so that's a difficult question for me to answer. I'm sorry. It's just because to be honest, I'm just not happy with Schenkerian analysis. I think the other part is that I don't like explaining things away. So I think that often what Schenker does is explain away things instead of confronting them as a problem. For him, there's always a solution, and I don't think that there's always a solution. I think that there are interpretations, but not solutions. So I'm sorry that I can't answer your question satisfactorily. But that does mean I need to read more about his ideas on improvisation, which I confess I never taught when I taught Schenkerian analysis.
Okay, thank you. I'm mentioning improvisation because the idea of a long-range control of all the details, I understand when he says improvisation, he means that it would be completely impossible to have total control, total rational control of what happens in a masterpiece, as he calls it. Yeah. So in this sense, this could somehow bring closer the idea of the intuition that keeps all those variables in the game of
yeah, actually, all right. So I'm glad you explained it to me because I think that is an interesting way to think about it. That if we think of the piece as an improvisation, yes, it's impossible to control everything that's going on. So that's really interesting. But it brings me to and it doesn't counter your point, which I think is a very interesting one. It brings me to the idea of tonality itself in the 20th century. So let me put it this way. Through the end of the 19th century, composers are basically European composers are basically swimming in tonality. They are fish in the tonal waters, and a fish doesn't know what water it is. It just swims in it without knowing. Just like, I can't see oxygen, and then not suddenly, but at a certain point in early modernism, people start to know, oh, tonality is just a convention. It's a convention of composition, and I can play with it all I want. And so I think of Prokofiev as in that school of, I don't have to follow these rules. I mean, tonality is a convention, and I'm going to play with it. That's one place. When things don't work in Prokofiev, because he has these wrong notes like all over the place. They're basically like his signature. You can tell Prokofiev right away because you hear something that's tonal and then these notes that are jabbing out. And it's almost as if he's saying, look, tonality is just a plaything, and I'm playing with it right now. That's a very different, project. But I do like your idea of thinking of it as an improvisation too, where no, I'm not in control of all of these elements because it's sort of like an improvisation around, an idea. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, and just to finish, maybe improvisation could be a channel for culture to speak. This speech of the culture that goes through the composer. We could call it improvisation. That's just the idea I asked you about.
Yeah.
But thank you for your considerations too.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Let me.
I think, sorry, just to follow up. I don't remember if it's Schoenberg, but someone talks about a piece of music being like an improvisation that takes a very long time to write, that it's still like, I forget who it is, I'd have to look it up, but there's another, it's not Schenker, there's another kind of improvisation remark, I think it's Schoenberg, about how, well, it's just an improvisation, but it's taking me a long time to do the improvisation, but that's a whole other topic. But thank you. I'm gonna think more about thinking of this as an improvisation where elements are not in control. And it's a perfect time because I'm writing this up as a paper, right? I mean, it's something that I want to publish, so it's a perfect time for me to read more.
In the same context of those notes that don't resolve, why don't we speak about cone promissory notes?
Yeah, so it's this is very interesting. So I just mentioned this. It's almost like I fed you the question. I'm writing this up as what I hope will be a published paper right now, and I actually start with cone because cone, in essence, is talking about a pitch class motive. They just didn't have that term, So he, since you know the article, I think it's an E natural. There's an E natural that doesn't resolve properly, and then he shows where the E comes back, and then he says, well, here, and this is another kind of Schenkerian idea, 26 bars later, I forget exactly where, the E finally moves up to F. And but what he forgets is that, and he doesn't mention this, there's a big key signature of E major even after that. So the E doesn't really disappear when he says that it does. I think he's trying to make it disappear because he wants everything to fit. I don't want everything if it does fit, then it fits. But if it doesn't fit, then it doesn't. But the interesting thing to me about your question is that his whole discussion then leads to a hermeneutic. In fact, I think the subtitle is like a study in hermeneutics or something like that. And he comes up with this idea that the E natural represents an unpleasant thought that Schubert is trying to master, but just really can't master properly. And then at the end, he does exactly what you asked me about Prokofiev, which this part is hard to buy. He says that it's syphilis. The unpleasant thought is syphilis itself. And that's where I go, well, it could be, but it could be, my coffee is burnt. It could be any unpleasant thought. But yeah, that's very interesting because that's kind of my approach right now is he basically uses a pitch class motive to come up with a meaning for that Schubert piece.
Therefore, you are against Kohn.
Yeah, that's
That's why you don't bring him,
that's right. Yeah, exactly.
May I ask one question? Well, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Klein, for your talk. It was very enjoyable. It was a great pleasure to see it. And I was just curious because I saw in one of your slides that you mentioned Hepukowski and Darcy. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious how you're reading, if you're reading Lacanian reading relates to their hermeneutics and to their hermeneutical reading of the piece and in thinking about the sonata trajectory and things like that.
Sure. In fact, that I just kind of cut that out when I was talking because I knew I was going to go on too long, and now I've done anyway. So, in their terms, they have what they call the type 2 sonata. So a type 2 sonata is one where the first theme doesn't come back in the recapitulation. It starts with the second theme. And I don't want to get into the weeds too much. They also have what they call a type 2 rondo. And the type 2 rondo is what we all learned as A, B, A, C, B, A. Okay, so there's no A like after the development. Well, we have a problem here because this is a 3-key sonata. First of all, in terms of hermeneutics, for Hepukowski and Darcy, a cadence is very, very important. So a cadence really seals, they even say, seals the fate of a theme. So if a theme is a positive theme and it has a cadence, it means there's a success. And if a theme is in a minor key and there's a cadence, it means there's been a failure. Well, the first problem we have is that there are no cadences in the piece at all. There are there are no perfect authentic cadences. They're all these imperfect cadences. So we can't really use that the cadence idea. What we can use is they do talk about the second theme being a kind of alternate reality, that when it comes back in the proper key at the end, and if it comes back with a cadence, means that everything has been solved. But our problem here is that Prokofiev uses 3 themes, and the only positive theme, or positive emotionally, is the second theme. And when it comes back at the end, there's still another theme to go. And so, you could use Hepukowski and Darcy for this, but it doesn't get us. It just doesn't get me very far. And then the last problem is, if this were a true type 2 sonata, you would, after the development, you would go to the second theme and then the first theme, and I'm not even sure where the third theme would go. But I think that the 3 themes basically come in reverse order, and they say there's no such thing as a reverse recapitulation. Well, not in Mozart, but I think this is a reverse recapitulation. So I would have to challenge them on that and say, well, in this case, it is reversed. The 3 themes do come back. They just come back in reverse order. So those are kind of the challenges that you would have to face it doesn't mean you can't use Hepukowski and Darcy, but those are the challenges you face when if you try to use their work. So.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, anybody else? We are going late. I think we should stop here. But if there is somebody that still wants to talk something, I would make an opening, open a door for a last thought. Otherwise, we finish. Nobody? Okay. So I thank you very much for you, Professor Michael Klein, and for everybody that prepared questions and went all along to this point. We are going almost 3 hours now of talk, or 2.5 at least. And see you next meeting in 2 weeks, where we will have talking Portuguese. Now is about the book of harmony of Herlein. He's releasing a new version of the book of what he calls combinatorial harmony, very interesting subject. And I thank you all for that, for your presence here, and we'll see you later in another session. Thank you very much again, Professor Michael Klein. And I will end the session just now. Bye.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you all.
It was a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
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 Have a nice Sunday.
Yes, thank you.